yourself, if possible, Tim, and tell the students a bit about what you do. And then I've got some questions sort of about your route, your A levels, you change from MFL obviously to sciences,
Hmm.
and sort of careers and those sorts of options. So could you give the students a brief overview of what you do, what's involved?
Yeah, okay. What I do currently, and welcome everybody, good afternoon. What I do currently is really two things. I specialize in sustainable finance, which sounds odd, but if I just describe it as one of the biggest projects I'm involved in at the moment is, typical Liverpudlian, is actually helping people recover from debt. About 66% of the UK working population have serious debts. And so what I've done with some very bright, intelligent people is we've imported a Brazilian idea, and we actually do salary deducted loans. So the employee has a debt, they aggregate their debt with a company, it's called Neighbour, Neyber, just to confuse everybody. And because we're deducting the money from salary, we're able to offer a much lower rate of interest. And on average, it's about 7.9% at the moment. It'll probably go down a bit lower. So that's much better than going to, one of the, high street lenders who are only out to con people and charge anything up to 1,000% interest. So that's been a really worthwhile project. I've been working on that for 6 years. We've got now nearly 2 million employees, so that's about 1/15. What what is that? 8% about of the whole working population on the platform, and we've lent about, I think now currently we've lent about £50 million. And the big idea is, and I'll come back to my career, latterly in my career I was involved in employee education, and one of my big concerns is wealth in retirement and people being able to have a dignified retirement. If people are in serious debt, then obviously they can't afford to save. So we have to get them out of debt. So we're in effect, to sum it up, turning bad debtors into good savers. So that's a really interesting project, and it's very much, if I'm going to refer to a phrase quite a bit in this conversation, environment, social and governance, ESG. ESG is the big thing nowadays. People don't call it sustainability, they don't call it corporate social responsibility. It's known as ESG, environment, social and governance. And that's about running, good companies in good ways to do good things. I'll sum it up like that. And then the other thing I do, going back right to my beginnings in the environment, hence the reason to need to come up to Warrington, I actually help companies build new plants to convert waste into energy, or to develop new ways of developing energy sources. So, for example, we take food waste and convert it into jet fuel. Fat lot of good that is at the moment. But that's what we do, amongst other things. And I actually have to, once I've helped these plants with their finance structures, and these plants can cost anything from 12 to 100 million pounds to build, we then actually conduct audits of them to make sure they're abiding by what were the former EU rules, but basically, as in the UK now, under Ofgem, the Office for Energy and matriculation, in effect. And we have to make sure that they're all actually complying with the rules to obtain their grants from the government for the work they do. So two very different areas. And in fact, I think there's the clue about the environment and what you can do in the environment.
Okay,
So that's what I do now.
okay, brilliant. So if I take you back then to when you were at school,
Hmm.
um, I did read briefly in your bio that you really enjoyed modern foreign languages
Yes.
and you changed your mind to sciences. So what influenced that decision and why did you make that decision?
Um, well, I started becoming interested in the environment because at the time when I was a kid, age 16, there were some major environmental disasters. There was Love Canal in America, where babies were growing deformed in the womb, and terrible, terrible incidents. There was a Minamata disaster in Japan, where it was first noticed that cats were behaving eccentrically around the port. and it turned out to be mercury poisoning. And in good old Liverpool at Runcorn, we had the former company Imperial Chemical Industries who taken over a company called Solvay. I think Solvay is now renamed again. And the Solvay process is to make chlorine from a brine solution using a mercury anode. So for those scientists listening, they'll probably know exactly what I'm referring to. But basically, unfortunately, the old ICI plant was very old. I think it was built in the 1930s. And it had quite a heavy mercury load going into the Mersey. And that's how I became a member of the Friends of the Earth, and really became convinced that if we didn't start improving the way we treated the world, that it would only backfire on us, which is quite ironic, really, in the present times. But that was exactly my belief. So that's how it started.
So, what A levels or equivalents did you take then, Tim?
I took physics, maths, chemistry, pure and applied, and I took general studies. Actually, just want to highlight as well, because I think it's very important for the people listening. I'm not fully au fait, and I apologize, with what are the best universities and colleges for doing any environmental sustainability work. I mean, clearly, as I put in my little bio, Cambridge and Oxford both have excellent units. London at Imperial is preeminent at the Grantham Institute, and I think everybody should make a note of the Grantham Institute at Imperial. That's really a master's course, the same as Oxford and Cambridge are running as well. In terms of where the Bachelor of Science degrees are, obviously it used to be Leeds, Lancaster, University of East Anglia, they all had good courses, but they're all quite different. And in fact, I mean, ironically, you asked me the question about why I gave up modern languages. I really enjoyed Latin at school, sounds odd. But I did, and picked up French quite well, enjoyed French, still enjoy speaking French. I spent quite a bit of time in Cologne for various reasons, actually mainly through my father, who's a railway engineer specializing in high-speed trains. And I love German. And so I'd really set my heart on doing modern languages. And my father, he had actually failed to become a doctor when he was a kid because his mother had a nervous breakdown. So he was absolutely convinced I should become a doctor to carry on that tradition in the family. Or in fact, the family was railway engineers right through for 4 generations. And so when I said I was going to do sciences, he was delighted because he thought I was going to become an engineer. And then I told him I was really interested in the environment, and he just thought that was tree hugging and rubbish. Which is, I put in my bio. I mean, it was quite ironic. And when I started, there were only 2 universities doing it: Westfield College in London and Leeds. I think Lancaster was about to start. So it was quite a change. And in fact, I majored on geology, which I'd never done, biology, which I'd never done. So I had to go through, in effect, an A-level course on both of those to get going in my first year. And then I really focused on ecology and really social geography. So that's how it came about.
And what made you choose environmental sciences then at university?
'Cause I really wanted to become an ecologist. I really wanted to specialize, ironically, in rehabilitating contaminated land because of growing up in the northwest, the coal mines around, Manchester, into the Pennines, into Yorkshire, huge coal spoil tips as when I was growing up as a kid. And obviously, when I was I think it was about 11 maybe at the time, we had the Aberfan disaster when the coal spoil tip, fell on school and killed all the children. So for those reasons, I thought, it'd be good to get into rehabilitating contaminated land. And in fact, that's really how I first got into waste disposal. Sounds a bit odd.
Was that your first job after university then?
Yes,
was that the first thing you did?
Actually, to make you laugh, when I left college, we were in the midst of one of the major oil crises. So I had to do 6 months on the trolleys and the cash tills at Sainsbury's in Muswell Hill in North London with my wife. And then I'd held out to get a job with a company called Redland Pearl, which is now Veolia. Everybody probably know Veolia. But it's been through various machinations. It was acquired by an Australian company called Cleanaway. But they had a very big scientific interest, doing a lot of research work into contaminated land. And so I'd actually been and visited some of their facilities as a student and was really interested in it. I know it sounds odd to be interested in waste management, but it's a fascinating area. And so when they offered me the job, I jumped at it. But that was 6 months after I'd actually graduated, sadly. Yeah. So
That's pretty quick, really.
I suppose so. Yeah. I mean, I think in the old days, everybody thought the milk round, you'd actually go straight into a job immediately from
Yeah.
college, but it wasn't like that. No. And in fact, I did a lot of research work in waste management. We used to have two terrible processes. One was burning hazardous waste, and I invented technology for looking into how small mammals picked up the contamination. We all walk around with contamination in our bodies, and particularly in our body fats, from organochlorine chemicals and things like that. But we used to specialize as a company. We were the only company in the United Kingdom at that time. We had an incinerator at Ellesmere Port, one in Rainham, and we specialized in burning really hazardous industrial waste. I also looked into methane recovery from landfill sites, which was a big problem. We had a near catastrophe in Kent at one of our sites where methane had leaked into somebody's house. And we were pumping methane out to stop it moving into the housing. And I also did a really interesting project, which was quite interesting. I want to come back to that maybe if I can, about how industry can work with society and government. And the company I'd worked for had always had a really bad reputation with the local government in Essex particularly, and Northumberland. And I instituted tree planting programs, A, to screen the sites, and B, to try and restore them after they were finished. And it became such a specialization. I did a lot of work with the Forestry Commission, and I was lucky enough to go to America, to go to Canada, and go to Germany to see how they were looking at reforestation of landfill sites, which is quite difficult because obviously landfill sites generate methane, and that can make the soil go anaerobic. So that was really the beginning of that. Okay,
Um,
Vicky?
yeah, wonderful. Can I ask you as well? Um, can you tell us about some of the emerging careers and the exciting careers that are available for our students interested in these areas?
Yes, I really wanted to major on that because forget about all me, I'm a boring old fart. I think the most important thing is, what you can all do
Yeah.
to follow in the tradition now. Um, One thing I'd actually counsel you to do, and I'm not advertising it, I was asked to join it a little while ago, but the organisation I sent through the link to Vicky and Lisa for IEMA would be quite worth looking at if you're really interested in the careers in that area, because it is a very broad territory. And IEMA does tend to get into all of the areas from public health right the way through to serious environmental monitoring and environmental finance. But what I wanted to just mention to everybody, I think, is when you're considering a career, it's very common to look at your parents and look at your family and look at your siblings and think about going into a career similar to them. I think in the times that we're in now, and particularly after the crisis we're just experiencing, I would encourage everybody to try and take a more futurist view on what the world's going to be like maybe in 5 or 10 years' time. Not easy, I know, and obviously, perhaps the advice you give, Vicky, is very much based on what you know now about careers. But I think the important thing is that we know that oil, carbon, is going to be defunct, and that's been accelerated in the last few weeks with the oil price going negative. So for stranded assets to be replaced by other sources of energy, which for example, electric vehicles, an HGV is not a non-starter at the moment working on electricity, but hydrogen offers a great deal of capability for public transport and for heavy goods vehicles and moving freight around. Oil is actually really a terrible thing as well in marine transport. So for all those reasons, I think looking at the demise of the carbon economy is going to give rise to a huge amount of opportunity for everybody. Massive amounts of investment going into hydrogen, massive amounts of investments going into converting waste into methane and other products like jet fuel, as I mentioned before. And also as I put in my little brief synopsis and as I highlighted in my own career currently, um, large institutions like insurance companies and pension funds are very keen to invest in the environment. If I go back a few years ago, when I worked for Redland Group, which was really a construction materials company in the beginning, and we invented anti-skid pans, outside, zebra crossings, those things. That was a Redland product, interestingly. But that group would really only look at a project if it had a return on investment within 13 years. So in other words, they were looking at something like 6% per annum interest return on the initial investment that they were making. A little while ago, some environmental projects were looking at a 25% return on investment. So in other words, if, like Diageo, at one of your big whiskey plants up in Scotland, you decided it was actually more cost effective to start treating the waste and making it into methane, you could actually get your money back in 4 years. And that revolutionized the whole area of environmental finance. So I think that the one thing I'd encourage everybody to do is look at the future, consider how the institutional market is actually looking at the environment much more differently now. It's actually considering it as a real fertile area for investment. And what are those new investments going to focus on? I mean, Tesla's been a massive success, obviously, as we all know. And, that guy's done really well in spite of himself. But there's a company that's come from nothing. And I think that's going to be a modern trend. These companies are going to emerge from, like Amazon has. Nobody ever thought that retail and high streets would die. When I was a kid, we always thought we'd go and get our bacon from the grocer. But nowadays, everything has moved so quickly. I think that this economy will move incredibly quickly now. And in fact, even the government itself in the United Kingdom and the European Union is looking at this area for specific investment to recover the economies across Europe. And don't forget China. China has accelerated in leaps and bounds from a country that was building a new coal-fired power station every day, to a situation where they're now one of the leaders in environmental investment and environmental technology. And they've done that because they realized their mistake about the pollution that they've created in their major conurbations, and also the realization that the old saying used to be the green economy is the lean economy. So money invested in green can have a very high payback. But that really highlights that you can get into the environmental area as an institutional investor. You can get into the environment as a finance specialist. You can get into the environment by being a public health person, the good old way, right the way back to Victorian times, or you can become an environmental chemist or an environmental biologist. The one thing I'd always say, though, out of all the people that I've ever had working for me and I've worked with, I think the people who've had a basic, broad scientific understanding, who then maybe put a master's on finance on top of that, or good old MBA, have always been the most successful in the environmental field. The broad education's done well to begin with, and then on top of that they developed a particular specialization, finance, whatever it may be. And that, I think, has really worked very well. So I'd counsel everybody to consider that option initially, maybe.
And what's the most exciting development you've seen recently, Tim?
Oh, definitely new technologies coming into waste management. It's quite astonishing the rate we're moving. Ironically, I did a major research project for the European Union, which actually led to the green bin in the United Kingdom. It was called the Grüne Tonne in Germany. But we inherited that recycling system from Germany, and it's now European-wide. And obviously, it's a thing we normally have every day now in the United Kingdom, possibly not during coronavirus. But waste management technology now is we used to consider things like pyrolysis, which is high heat treatment of waste, to make them into, well, converting plastics into oil, basically, and recycling plastics. Obviously, we've all heard about plastics lately. That's been a huge issue. But just taking, I mean, even everybody will know Ginster's pasties. But if you look at a Ginster's delivery lorry when it's turning up at your local shop or your local filling station, you'll notice it has a strange thing underneath the lorry, which looks like a hopper system. And that's exactly what it is, because they do pasties on sale or return. And if they don't sell the pasty at the filling station, at the BP filling station, they take the pasty back and make it into methane at the factory. And that's what they use to cook the pasties. So they're cooking the pasties using old pasties that they've turned into methane by a process of anaerobic digestion. Sounds disgusting, and it's very messy and very smelly. But once you've worked in waste management, you can cope with anything. And it's, you know, that's the sort of, in fact, I think the big thing that I'd suggest to everybody looking at now is what's known as the closed circle. That, you know, we won't dispose of waste now. We will actually always consider the end of life. And if we'd stayed in Europe, there would have been a project to look at the end of life of all products. But I think you'll find that companies, and there's a really interesting area to get into. If you look at a smartphone, particularly an iPhone, it's virtually unrecyclable, yet it's full of very, very precious metals, the same as a Toyota car battery is, as well. Your Prius car battery is full of rare earth metals, which largely, unfortunately, come from either Mongolia or China. So looking at the recycling of some of those very, very complicated items is going to be fascinating. And also designing products so that they are more recyclable, or can be fixed, or can be modified and updated, because our economy hitherto has really relied on us buying a new iPhone every year or so, or a new tablet every 2 years. I think that'll change. Obviously, that changes the whole nature of the manufacturing economy, which why it's such a smart move to go into sustainability in a way, or the new economy, as I called it. Does
So
that
if you were,
help?
yeah, absolutely does, yeah. And if you were giving advice to our current sixth formers, what advice would you be giving? What could they be doing now to help them with their sort of future careers, and what could they be getting involved in to make themselves stand out?
Okay, I think go and have a look at IEMA. Go and have a look at some of the case studies in sustainability,
Yeah, I've
end of
just
product.
posted the link for that actually on the left-hand
Yeah,
side in the conversation box. Yeah.
yeah, and just Google the circular economy. Have a look at the Chartered Institute of Waste Management, CIWM. Also, have a good look. Sign up for the Grantham newsletter from Imperial College. I can send you the link if you want, Vicky.
Yeah, that'd be
Um,
great.
but the Grantham Institute is probably one of the world leaders. You know, do a lot of work for the United Nations Environmental Programme. As we've all heard, it's got a massive immunology department as well. In recent weeks, that's been very prominent. But Imperial's been fairly preeminent, together with Cambridge and Oxford, in leading some of the new thinking about the environment and our economy. And I think that's been the massive change in my life. We were regarded as the tree huggers, the outsiders, the hippies. Everybody thought we were a bit weird, and nobody could understand why we're studying what we were studying. But now it's absolutely central to the economy. You know, it is the spine of the economy, and it will rapidly, in my mind, and in fact, that's a very important point to make, I think. There are a few companies now, Unilever, Kingfisher, trying to think of some others. I think Procter and Gamble as well. Quite a few of the people who are now in the boardroom of these major institutions, particularly Unilever, have actually come up the sustainability route, which is surprising, isn't it? Because you'd normally expect it's somebody from finance, wouldn't be somebody from human resources, but it'd probably be somebody who's had a really good operational, financial perspective on the company's operations. And I did say this in my bio. Some of the brightest and best people I've ever employed, and I've had a fairly disparate career going into management consulting, have actually been the young kids, South Africans, Czechoslovakian, English, Australian, who've actually come through the environmental sustainability background. There's some very, very smart kids out there, and they're moving up the career ladder very quickly. There's always a negative though, and I'll mention a negative at the moment. Always to put a damp squib on one thing is money. Hitherto, the environmental sector was very poorly paid relative to the general management sector. When I was a kid, the salaries I would get as an environmental consultant, and I mean a top flight environmental consultant age 27, going to Hong Kong, writing the environmental protection policy for Hong Kong, working in Saudi on the third rejuvenation program for the Saudi economy with Bechtel, the big American consultancy. My salary was about half what it would be in management consultancy. And the day rates still, as a consultant, are still depressed. They're about 2/3 the rate you'd be paid as a management consultant, probably about the same as you get paid as an IT consultant. But I think that will change, and it's all about supply and demand. I think if bright young people are coming through and companies like Unilever desperately need them, and if you look at the people in the staffing of Unilever's sustainability department, they are American, yes, they are Dutch in part, they're Israeli, they're South African. It's a very portable career. And in fact, that's one of the exciting things about working in the environment. It can be very global very quickly. I mean, I was traveling the world age 23. And it was very exciting doing that because then that's how you learn best practice. But I think that remuneration pattern, the salaries that people are getting, will change over the next 5 years. But hitherto, over the last certainly 40 years, salaries in the environmental sector were depressed. But it will change. But there are lots of developments. I just urge everybody to look at, look at a recyclable toothbrush. Why are we doing that? Who's making it? Where's it coming from? Where's it being manufactured? There are some really basic items. Even a toothpaste canister now, a toothpaste tube, is now generally recyclable. And that involves a lot of technology, a lot of process knowledge, but also it requires people to know about logistics, how you collect these wastes, how you sort them, how you transport them, and how you then reprocess them to turn them into new product. Circular economy is going to be a big thing, definitely.
What's been the most enjoyable part of your career, Tim? Which role did you enjoy the most and why?
I think in the main where environment crosses with politics. I actually had a very, very bad experience in Hong Kong. And we were requested to go and investigate the building of a coal-fired power station at a place called Deep Harbour Bay, which was a misnomer. It was an oyster bed, and it was only about a metre deep. And in fact, going back there was like stepping back into the Vietnam War. There were bamboo huts on stilts in this beautiful estuary of the Yellow River. And China Light and Power, which was one of the two big Hong Kong power companies, and Hong Kong is obviously a massive consumer of energy. Hong Kong was largely liquid gas and oil fired for its economy, and they decided they wanted to bring in cheap Polish, South African and Australian coal. The big problem is that when you burn it, you end up with a massive boron pollution problem. So the company was going to build this massive bund and dam into the Yellow River estuary and tip the fly ash, which is, makes a huge amount of fly ash from brown coal or lignite. Obviously the massive danger was this was going to seep into the bay and kill the oyster beds, which fed the oyster menus in most of the Hong Kong and Chinese restaurants just across the border. Margaret Thatcher had just come to power, and I wrote a report, and in fact there were some extraordinary things that happened to me. My luggage got interfered with on the flight into Hong Kong and checked quite visibly, and in fact was replaced by Cathay Pacific Airlines within 12 hours. Actually, it was quite extraordinary. There's definitely something weird going on. And whenever I travelled out to this strange place, which was in the Northeast New Territories, it's about 25 miles out of Hong Kong, you had to get on the rapid transit railway, which you've all seen on the news lately, and then get a taxi. out to this lovely, most beautiful village. All sorts of strange things would happen. You know, the taxi driver would lose his direction. I'd book a taxi to get home, back to the hotel in Hong Kong in Chim Chat Choi, and it wouldn't turn up. I had to walk. There are all sorts of strange things happened. And the most peculiar thing happened. We had a drilling rig there, and we were taking samples out of the bay. And when I went to the laboratory in Hong Kong to look at the samples in the university, I noticed they'd switched the samples, and they changed the labels on the samples. And what it was, you know, it was the Hong Kong business mafia were trying to ruin all the work I was doing. And in fact, the money for the new power station was going to be largely from the UK government, and the engineering was coming from what used to be known as the CEGB, the Central Electricity Generating Board. And Maggie Thatcher was really strongly behind this project, even flew out to Hong Kong to endorse it. And signed the contract with the Hong Kong government. And then there was little old me and my team of 4 technicians trying to work out how they were going to do this safely and securely. And it was absolutely fascinating, but quite scary, because I just never knew what was going to happen next. And it's like a movie, you know, there are all sorts of really odd things happening. At first I just thought it was fate, and then I started thinking, no, this, you know, and I was being watched. Quite clearly in the hotel, everywhere I was going. So I think those days that you know shows you how controversial the environment was. We wrote the report, and in fact I recommended that they line the reservoir with a membrane that was made by a German company called Schlegel. It's like a rubber membrane, very thick. It's about 5 millimeters thick. You could even drive a bulldozer over and it doesn't tear. And that's what we did. We lined the lagoon with Schlegel membrane, and that was my landfill knowledge, you know, from my waste management experience, and it was a big success. I think the power station's still operating. I'm not quite sure, but you know, it proved to me how once the environment comes into conflict with government and parliament and the government's determined to do something, as in both the Hong Kong and the British governments, it can get quite interesting. So that was probably, although that made me leave the career, because I thought I'm only earning £13,000 and I'm going to get a knife in my back when like walking down through Chim Chat Choi. And I'm not joking, that's how I felt. I was very careful when I went to a restaurant. I always sat with my back to the wall. I came home just in time for Christmas. I was quite glad to get on the aeroplane, actually, and tell you. And it was fascinating because when I got back to the office and told my bosses what had happened, they said, "Oh, well, no surprise." I remember saying to my boss, you know, well, thanks for telling me, thanks for warning me. I had no idea how political it was.
What a great story. Obviously, you did environmental science at university.
Yeah.
In terms of the people you work with, there's quite a spread of degree subjects that you've seen too.
Yeah, I think people have done pure sciences quite a bit, you know, biology. Quite a few people have come into the area through geography, because geography courses now tend to have a social planning element to it, and that's quite important in the area too. Actually, one company, if you want to have a really good look at a company, and here's another great story, that company has sent me out to Hong Kong. At the time, it was only 9 people, run by a Jewish New York pianist, of all things, whose husband was head of corporate affairs for Procter & Gamble. That company is now 5,000 people worldwide, and the name of the company is ERM. I'll send you that link as well. ERM Incorporated. It's the world's largest environmental consultancy. And if you just look at the kind of projects that ERM is doing, or any of its competitors, most of the competitors tend to be American or Canadian. Quite a few are French or Dutch. ERM is preeminent though, and for example, ERM will do a project to look at the launch of a new product for Unilever, what could be its environmental consequences, but it'll also do the environmental impact assessment for HS2, and that's quite a common thing. So in doing an environmental impact assessment, you probably ought to really have some geography and economic and social skills in that mix to do environmental impact assessment. Environmental impact assessment is a fascinating area, by the way, and I think it comes into every major infrastructure plan now, even a new nuclear power station in the United Kingdom. Very multi-skilled, very multidisciplinary, which also makes the territory really interesting to work in, because you will be working with pure nuclear scientists, you will be working with pure petrochemical experts or whatever, or railway transport people, whatever the project will be. But it's about making a decision based on all the best practical environmental options, as they call it, BPEO, that you bring to the table in terms of the study. So many houses have to be demolished for the construction of the station at Euston in London for HS2. It goes through miles of woodland. Some of it's being tunneled to avoid environmental damage, which adds to the cost. So in terms of looking at the overall project and doing that environmental impact assessment, it really is multi-skilled, but big planning component. So as you asked the question, geography, pure sciences, some people coming from finance, definitely. But interestingly, I think all the young people that have worked for me, and women and men, have always had a deep interest in the environment to begin with, and they've pursued that. And they've then gone on to a master's or a PhD in that area quite often before they join. So brainy people, huge openings in Eastern Europe for this. The Eastern European community is still quite a long way behind on environmental protection, but catching up very, very fast now in Poland and Czechoslovakia. Russia, forget about it, but it will have to one day. They've got some massive environmental issues out in Russia, and also the Far East. There are lots of sections of the Far East economy that still have major environmental problems. Burning forests, reforestation, Brazil, South America. Those are some of the interesting projects that really come through. A lot of people, by the way, in the environmental sector do work in the third sector, as it's known. In other words, in the NGOs, non-government organizations, and the charities. Some very bright people in those areas as well, doing great work, often for very little money, but they're doing it for the experience, to get out to the Philippines and look at the impact of the fisheries there, working in Australia, looking at the impact of coal mining. So, massive opportunities all around the world, and don't restrict yourself just looking at the UK market in any sense. America's a mess as well.
Beyond qualifications then, Tim, what do you look for in an employee?
Aptitude and flexibility, I think. I think, somebody who comes to you who's got an inquiring mind and is not prepared to accept a status quo or a given argument, and is prepared to challenge it and say, well, why don't we do it a different way? Why don't we think about this in a completely creative fashion? I think those are the key skills. So somebody's always prepared to think out of the box in an intelligent way, but with a practical slant on it and with a strong economic slant. Every project these days has got to be financed. Often that can work in the favor of an environmental project, as I've said. But I think, for those people who can suddenly spot an opportunity, somebody's going to look at the whole automotive electric car battery market and one day come up with a brilliant solution for recycling those. I know it sounds ridiculous, but nobody's actually perfected how to recycle mattresses yet. Sounds bonkers, doesn't it? But mattresses are a mess of materials, and to actually recycle those components, it's almost a hand operation. It's actually manual labor to separate the components. When I was a kid, we were just inventing car fragmentation plants. You'd get a car and shred it, and that seemed to me just amazing. But that was brand new technology. So those things I'm sure will come about in these more refined markets. And as I said, some of the materials that are in these products, your iPhone and your car battery, are some of the rarest materials in the world. Oh, and that's another very interesting slant on this as well. You may well have read as students that the Army, and in fact the American military, are actually very, very preoccupied with the potential global conflicts that can come about from the environment. The biggest one particularly in Africa, is the fight for water. And you've seen countries in Africa who've built a dam up the Nile, which has then denied the whole Nile Valley of water for its agriculture, and also the sediment that comes down the Nile every year when it floods. Um, that could be a major area of global conflict, because if you're losing the livelihood of 25% of your population, you're probably going to mobilize your army. And joking apart, Sandhurst, MI5, GCHQ have got large departments looking at potential environmental threats to global stability. And I think that's been a fascinating thing for me. I said, where politics comes into contact with the environment. If you look at the Davos summit every year, and I look at the Davos summit this year, by all means, and I know it sounds a bit highfalutin, but it's all quite practical stuff, honest. If you look at the Davos summit, what the global business community does every year, forget about Donald Trump, he can't add up one and one, but the global business community and the global political community who make sense, every year they look at what the major threats to global stability are, and they issue a report on it. It's called the Davos Summit Report. Usually it's a graph, a bar chart, an infographic, very simple, but it'll put at the top what those big environmental threats are. Ironically, and working in the sector I do in institutional finance, 8 years ago after SARS, I think it was 8 years ago, the biggest threat to the global economy was seen as a pandemic. Quite ironic, isn't it? The biggest global threat to the economy over the last few years has probably been stability for resources like water, rare earths, and also finance, really. I think finance has become a much tougher issue as global trade has shrunk and the Chinese have dominated global trade until recently. So those are the threats they've seen. But if you go back and look at the Davos summit reports for the last maybe decade, you'll see some really interesting patterns coming through. A lot of people were saying, in fact, I did this with my own clients 5 years ago. I told them that, well, 10 years ago and 5 years ago, the biggest threat would be oil and stranded assets, the whole oil economy falling flat. And they laughed at me. Nobody ever believed it. Nobody ever saw that coming. Although everybody in the environmental field was beginning to see it coming, and you could see how wind power and solar was becoming much, much cheaper. Chinese dominate those markets together with Germany, really. And for those reasons, you could see the way the world was going to change. But Davos has always focused on that very neatly. And that might give you, as I said, I think, don't look at careers in the environment now. Think about 5 or 10 years ahead to where we might be. I don't mean we're flying to the moon, but I think, that we will live in a world where resources are much more restricted, and we need to be much more careful about how we use things and how we reuse things. So within that territory, there'd be some really interesting career opportunities, I think.
It's really helpful. I've put some links on the left-hand side, I think, that have supported the things that you've recommended students have a look at. Yeah. I just wanted to sort of put it to our students as well. That there's quite a few in the chat, and I just wondered, do any of you have any questions to ask Tim? I mean, he's had a really varied, exciting career, and I just wondered, does anyone have anything they would like me to ask him for you?
Don't be afraid.
No.
I don't bite. Any confusion? Is there anything I've said that's confused people, Vicky?
I think so. I am asking now. Quiet.
Okay. How are you all doing, students, anyway? I mean, it must be incredibly difficult learning and having contact like this. Are you coping? Who's going to talk?
I know.
I'll talk.
Go on, you talk.
Oh, no, it's just a bit. It's kind of boring, but it's giving you time to learn different skills that might be useful for the future, which I think is quite good.
Yeah, very good point. Yeah, very good point.
So I've spent some time. I've tried to do a bit of Excel, advanced Excel, and some computer science as well. I think that might be useful for the other times, and kind of just research. Because I'm in upper six now, I've kind of had time that I wouldn't have had to kind of like research what I might want to do and stuff like that, which is quite good, I'd say.
Yeah. I mean, in any business now, and in fact, I'm still quite astonished by some of the people I meet my age who don't know Excel. Um, those kind of core skills. I mean, being able to put together decent reports in good written English, I think everybody coming out of merchants hopefully will be able to do that. That still counts for a huge amount. Being able to articulate an argument, stand on your 2 feet, make your points, and the classic boardroom confrontation now is you give them 5 minutes. You give them 5 minutes by the chief executive Unilever to make your point and then retire, and then they'll inform you of their decision, in a week's time. So if you can make those points really well, some of the stuff that these there's a young Bulgarian guy, he was in the Bulgarian Navy and he's now in the waste management industry in the United Kingdom. The Excel spreadsheets he compiles are better than an actuary. He's absolutely amazing at it, and he does all the high, medium, low forecasts on cash flow and the waste controls coming into these methane plants, converting agricultural food waste into methane. So being able to use any of those core, and unfortunately it is still Microsoft skills in the Microsoft platform, they're always going to do well. I had a very bad experience when I was about 35. I had a young lad when I was working in management consultancy, and we'd asked him all the really important questions about what he knew and his specialization, but I'd failed to ask him if he could actually use a computer, and he was conversing with Microsoft. And when he arrived in the office this morning, he said, well, where's my secretary? I said, we don't do that here. And I said, you mean you've never actually used Word? You've never used Excel? You've never used PowerPoint? And he said, no, never. I just used to write it on paper and give it to my secretary to type out. It's a large American company. It's quite a shock. But unfortunately now, modern business really does expect you to be, completely self-sufficient in all of the technology and everything you do. I mean, in some ways it helps. I mean, certainly the biggest change I've noticed in my career is, that there is no free time now. Wherever you are, a client can get at you. You can be on a remote island in Greece and they'll still get you. Smartphone carries enough capability as much as an Apollo 11. So, they'll expect you to work, unfortunately. So that's changed a lot. But, the more you can build up your core skills, writing, report writing, presentational skills, and good old, financial evaluation, really, really a good mark. Is it Christopher? Mark? M?
Matthew is.
It's Matthew. Yeah, it's a good point. Matthew, what do you think about a career in the environment then?
So I'm doing chemical engineering at university.
Oh, right.
So but it was mainly focused. I wanted to work in the energy industry or something to do with the energy industry potentially.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what I talked about. And then obviously a lot of the talk is about moving towards more sustainable stuff like solar power, tidal wind and all of this. But kind of when I kind of looked into it, the one, so I read this book, what was it called? Sustainable Energy Without the Hot Air. It was by he was a physics professor at Cambridge.
Right.
And it was kind of something I hadn't really thought about was sort of energy density of the renewable stuff.
Yep.
So when we look at nuclear is probably the best example in that you can get a huge amount of energy out of a very small amount of fuel.
Yep.
And even with oil and gas, you still get a reasonable amount out. Whereas I think I read that it was some fact that if you wanted to power all the country with biomass energy as one sort of example, you'd have to build an entire island out of trees the size of the UK, something along those lines, which is kind of what I thought of might be the limiting factor, in that you can improve the efficiency as much as you want of the wind turbines, the solar panels and stuff like this. So it's almost at maybe 99-100% efficiency.
Yeah. Yeah.
If you're really, really good at it, but you're never really going to improve the density of it. There's sort of a maximum amount you can get. which
It's a really
really
good point, Matthew. Yeah, it is. Um, I mean, obviously, the big problem about the sustainable energy sector is its variability, and that's what a nuclear scientist will always throw back at a wind farm engineer. Um, However, having said that, now we're moving to a position in the United Kingdom where we're probably we're having a lot of coal-free days. In other words, we burn absolutely zero coal. Um, and some days we're totally almost dependent on all the wind farms in the North Sea and the Irish Sea and everywhere else off Scotland. Some of the onshore ones in Scotland. But you're making a very valid point. But I think where you might actually score a lot of points is there's a really serious need once you've got the smart electrical engineers solving the problems and inventing the smart grids, which are much more community, much more locally based as opposed to the national grid structure we have at the moment, which we only saw last year fell over. One power station tripped out at Bedfordshire and it knocked out about a third of the country. People stranded on trains. So the need for the smart grid coming in the United Kingdom and other economies, particularly in America, is very important. Fortunately, we're quite advanced in that because our grid structure is really based around a lot of the work that was done in the 30s and 40s in the United Kingdom. But going back to the point you're making on chemical engineering, I think the people who are able to make hydrogen using sustainable electricity and being able to do that very effectively and economically will probably be a preeminent part of the transport sector and the fuel sector. We've got to remember that, I think it's 95% of households in the United Kingdom burn methane for their central heating. That will have to go in the next 20 years. So what's going to be the fuel that replaces it? Is it going to be electricity? How are we going to change the patterns of people's usage? And how do we convert waste materials or other materials, very effectively into energy? And you're quite right, biomass is very inefficient. It's almost as inefficient as raising a cow on corn to make steak in terms of feeding people. You're dealing with natural processes and you've got to concentrate the energy. So that could be quite a fascinating area. One thing I would say to you, Matthew, is one lady that worked for me was absolutely fascinated and I think is going on to do some research work in that territory, looking at the way biological processes operate and seeing to the extent that they can be industrialized. For example, the everyday fixing of carbon by plants. Can you recreate that? And that biotechnology area obviously has been huge in the pharmaceutical sector, but I predict in the next 20 years it could become quite large in the environmental sector as well. Even waste treatment. A lot of waste treatment is moving more now towards biological treatment rather than chemical treatment. Does that help? Matthew?
Yeah, no, that's great, thanks. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm conscious that we've had you for over an hour. I think some of our students have got another Skype lesson to go to.
Okay, all right.
So I've got one final question for you, and it actually comes from Lisa, and it's, what is your favourite memory of school?
Okay. Image magazine. Are you still doing that? No. Okay. We used to have a school magazine, and if I'll finish on a very quick story, which is actually quite funny. In fact, it's how I got into management consultancy because I knew all about typography and print and stuff like that. But I learned it all at school. Mr. Price, who died recently, Chris Price, created a school magazine, and we all used to work on it in the lunchtimes and evenings and at weekends. And we actually won 2 awards from the Daily Telegraph for the school magazine. It's called Image. I've still got copies of it. So we had poetry. We had people who did drawings and we converted them into, print blocks. We had people who did liner cuts. It was all very creative. And in fact, one of the big attractions, of course, was we used to work with a girls' school on it as well. So that was always quite good fun. But with Image, the thing I thought that was absolutely brilliant about it was that we took it from being just a school magazine into being a business. And we used to do letterhead for parents. And my fondest memory is doing the 350th year magazine. It was great fun. Still got a copy of it. should be updated for the 400th anniversary. But it was the history of the school that was set up by John Harrison, and I think we printed 5,000 copies and sold them.
I've never heard of it actually, but Lisa said that Image is a favourite memory of so many old boys and girls.
Yeah, yeah, it was
So it's really
really
sad that
neat.
it no
Yeah,
longer exists. Yeah, she has
yeah,
just said that.
yeah. It was a really dangerous thing because it was at the top of what used to be the prep school block above the headmaster's office.
Okay.
And we had these massive, great cast iron printing presses up there that were rumbling away on a very fragile floor. But my favourite memory, just very quickly, is we had Knowsley Safari Park when I was a kid. It was just introduced. And I was sent off to do a report on it with a guy called John Band, who I'm still friendly with. He was editor of Image. I was sub-editor. And we went to Knowsley, interviewed Lord Derby, I think. And he actually made a funny remark. He said, well, if the animals escape, they won't be able to tell them from the population in Knowsley, which we printed in the magazine, quoted him. And we'd actually checked him, and he was quite happy to have it quoted. But then we went to Southport Zoo, which was very, very distressing. And I remembered vividly there was this tiger waltzing him down who was very distressed. And, he was just couldn't sit still. He was really animated. And he was in a bad way as well. He looked very moth-eaten. So we wrote this report condemning Southport Zoo in the same article, looking at the future of animal sanctuaries and animal zoos and how they'd contribute, to, keeping wildlife sustainable all around the world. And not to know that one of the governors was actually a director of Southport Zoo. So his son proudly came home with the latest copy of it.
Oh no, I
Gave it to
can't
his dad.
even imagine.
And I was dragged into Mr. Hiram Mark Luff's
Oh,
study with John Band to ask for our rationale and reason for printing this article. But bless him, he was known as Noddy Price because he had a habit of nodding. Chris Price defended us vehemently in front of the headmaster and said, it's just journalism. What they're reporting is exactly what was found and what was said. And if you want to criticize them, you're criticizing free speech. So we got away with it.
that's brilliant.
Yeah.
Oh, I don't fancy doing that though.
No, but Image was great because it did get you into that territory, and,
Yeah.
it was a really lovely extracurricular activity. So there you go.
Well, thank you so much, Tim. I really appreciate your time.
All right, anytime.
Are you
Yeah.
happy for me to share your details in case any students want to contact you?
Of course. Yeah,
Yeah, that'd
anytime.
be wonderful. Thank you. And please, if you're ever in the area, you must contact me because it'd be an absolute pleasure to actually
Okay.
meet you face to face and to get you in front of some of our students.